Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing humans to Mars with NASA astronaut and SpaceX flight surgeon, Dr. Anil Menon. Learn about NASA's groundbreaking plans to send individuals to the Red Planet. While this would be a huge moment for our entire civilization, many questions remain. What are the challenges? What are the possible benefits? And how will this ultimately change life here on Earth? Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Dr. Anil Menon. He is on a trajectory to become the first human ever to step foot on Mars. As a decorated NASA astronaut and former SpaceX flight surgeon, Anil is leading the charge to finally have human beings on the Red Planet. The concept has been long discussed, but only recently has the feasibility of this mission become clear. As a space aficionado, I loved this interview. If brain surgery wasn't an option, I would definitely have become an astronaut. Listening to Anil discuss his goals was inspirational and drove me to learn more about NASA's plans. While the complexity and challenges of sending humans to Mars may be daunting, the potential benefits to our civilization cannot be denied. With overpopulation, global warming, and all types of existential threats mounting here on Earth, inhabiting Mars may be critical to the survival of our species. Listen up as we discuss humans to Mars. Check it out. Hey, Anil, how you doing?
I am doing good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for joining us all the way from Russia and here to discuss humans on Mars and your role as a NASA astronaut to get insight into when, where, why, how, and all the above. So again, thanks for joining us. Super interesting topic, and thanks for making the time in your busy schedule.
Yeah, no problem. I'm always excited to talk about NASA and to talk about space medicine because I feel like it's a field that's just going to explode in the next decade, and so we need to encourage more people to come and join the effort.
Well, tell us, along those lines, when and why did you first become interested in becoming an astronaut?
Yeah, I was at a movie called The Dream is Alive. It was a shuttle movie about fixing the Hubble telescope, and I was one of those kids who was like 6 years old, saw this movie, and I was just blown away that there was a job in space, and it seemed super cool. And so that was something I absolutely wanted to do and kept in the back of my mind, I think, for most of my life. So I later went and like kind of went into science because of that and got interested in what is it these astronauts do and what leads down this career path, and it helped direct and shaped my direction.
Now, prior to joining NASA, you worked at SpaceX on the Demo 2 mission. Tell us a little bit about what your role in that mission was.
Yeah, I was at NASA, working as a flight surgeon. I'd been there 7 years or so, and I had helped with a couple launches to space station. And so um, I got a feel for what space medicine was by working at NASA. And then SpaceX was closing in around 2017, 2018 period to the launch date of Demo 2, which would be the first commercial launch of astronauts to the space station. Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley. And so they were getting so close, they realized that they could use medical support for some of those things. And that's where I got involved. They opened up a job. It had never existed before, this kind of job, particularly at SpaceX. And I wasn't even sure at that moment in time 100% what I was getting into. I knew I loved space medicine. I had applied to be an astronaut and didn't get it. I knew that's where I wanted to continue my career. And so I went for it. And my wife and I both took a big risk in going there because it was a new place. We just had a kid and we had a great community at NASA. But we dove in. I started up at SpaceX. And at SpaceX, really what it was doing was three big things. One was development, and the other was some engineering, and the other was just pure clinical medicine. So under development, um, it was space medicine and emergency medicine melded together. So as the doctor there, we were building medical kits. So what would the kit look like in Dragon? What would the kit look like when you recover someone? What would the kit look like in launch? And to do that, you just have to have a good picture of all the things that can happen in each of those phases of flight. Um, and another aspect of that was like the actual operations. So I needed to develop the order that we would execute on things. So when someone landed in the water, I worked with the recovery team to figure out how do we get them out of the capsule with their their long-term adaptation back from being in space for 6 months or a year, and then we get them into a medical room, and then what do we do there, and where are all the things. And it even meant programming the Dragon capsule. So there was different conditions where you might land, where you don't want to land, and as a doctor at SpaceX, you're totally immersed with all the engineers and need to take on ownership of different things. And one of those things was that programming of some of the procedures that people might need to execute on their landing. And another pure clinical medicine part was really the other interesting thing that happened there during this Demo 2 mission was that was during the period of COVID. And it was a potential blocker to getting this launch off on time, because the impacts across the country and world. But we were able to just work with these brilliant engineers, work together, really understand what was going on, and make smart decisions as a company that allowed people to keep working, keep the launch on track. And even like when we compared our numbers to local geographic averages, they were 1/10 of that. And I think it was by being smart in terms of just clinical medicine. So it could kind of have an impact there and the overall company. A couple side points that kind of help illustrate that is we were one of the early adopters of masking during that time period. We did testing pretty early across the company, and even launched a cross-sectional study with Harvard that led to a Nature paper and was pretty interesting. And on the side, even made some solenoid valves for Medtronic ventilators, and lots of masks, and a ventilator itself that was handed off to Tesla. So clinical medicine, I say that because it's as much a part of taking care of people at the company as it is like doing the actual work of figuring out how you launch humans to space. You're always a doctor, no matter what you do.
Such an interesting background looking at SpaceX, and now that you're at NASA, and we're gonna talk about the idea of landing humans on Mars. Clearly, that's the next big space frontier. How long has NASA been planning this endeavor for?
If you look back historically, that's a tricky question to answer, because if you look back historically, the idea of going to Mars has always been in people's minds since the 40s and 50s. And NASA launched an orbiter, the Mariner 4 in 65, that did a fly around, took 21 pictures, and told us a lot about Mars. And since then, um, we've continued to launch a lot of autonomous vehicles that you've seen in the news and are just amazing, and are developed, a lot of them at JPL. But it's always kind of been in the ethos as something um, that we would like to do, is explore and inspire, and continue to develop these projects. Certainly, we went to the moon and continued to send out Mars exploration vehicles, but we've always been working towards that. And so, as long as I've been at NASA, I've always seen a plan. It might be decades from now, but always out there. Certainly, our near term goal has been to land on the moon as a test bed for going to Mars, and do that in a sustainable way and in a different way with today's technology. And it's a great learning platform for that as well. Even space station has elements that feed into the overall Mars plan. There's people who are living up there for 6 months. We've had 1 year astronauts, and that starts to get closer to that long duration Mars mission.
So along those lines, and I want to get into the nitty gritty. I mean, obviously, Mars is the logical choice based on size, distance. Um, but what exactly would it entail to land a human on Mars. How long is that trip? And give us some details about what that mission would look like.
Yeah, those kind of missions, it depends on how much, like, the physics of it is the driver of some of the technology, insofar as like how much energy do you want to expend to get to Mars. So um, there's some low energy models that let you get to Mars. At its lowest energy, you can get to Mars in 9 months for a transfer orbit to get you there, and you spend about 16 months on Mars surface to get that low energy orbit back to Earth. So you got to get off the surface back to Earth, and that's another 9 months back. And so I think those are the things that then drive all the medical elements. There's certainly faster ways to get to Mars. If you have unlimited fuel and propulsion, you could get there, in under a year, which would put us in the time frame of a ISS mission where we really understand a bit more about the medical challenges. But once you're starting to look at a realistic energy expenditure, which is that basically 3-year mission round trip, if you're counting it all, then you're starting to look at something that's outside of our current bounds of knowledge, where we've actually had people live. There's um, a Russian astronaut, Pokhorov, who's been in space for a very, very long time. But most of our longest missions are close to about a year. And so that's kind of the extent of our medical understanding. And we're starting to get a good sense of what that means and where our big question marks are in terms of understanding it better.
Yeah, so we're looking at a multi-year trip in space, and that's where the challenges come up. And also, Mars has tremendous challenges just physically and as a planet. And we'll go over a few and what NASA's plans are for them. I mean, number one, as opposed to Earth, Mars has no atmosphere really, so you can't block solar radiation. How would the astronauts deal with that solar radiation on Mars?
Yeah, so I think the big things are there's no magnetosphere, and that does a lot for the radiation. And then there's no atmosphere, as you said. Well, I should say there's 1% of Earth's atmosphere, which actually has a significant impact for some of these solar particle events. And you're getting two types of radiation. You're getting um, these galactic cosmic radiation, which are like protons and heavy elements flying around space at really high energy. And then you're getting these solar particle events, which are these solar flares, and they're getting shot off of the sun, but they're very unpredictable. So if you look back over the history of our human space flight, about every decade, there's some huge solar flare that if someone was up there during that time period, it would have a significant impact on people in terms of pushing them towards traditionally what we've seen in radiation sickness. So that's kind of what you're looking at. But we know from some of our NASA missions, we can characterize that radiation a bit. So we know that you get 1.8 millisieverts per day on the way to Mars, and that's because you got no atmosphere and you're way outside the magnetosphere and you're just traveling there. And so any of those solar particle events or galactic cosmic radiation are hitting you. Then on the surface of Mars, you get about 0.67 millisieverts a day. So now if you add all that up, I'll do the math for you. You get to around 1,300 millisieverts. And you think the European Space Agency has a limit of 1,000 millisieverts for an astronaut lifetime, and NASA has about a 600 millisievert limit. So that kind of like bounds where people are thinking is a reasonable amount of radiation exposure, and it kind of keeps you to a less than 3% risk of lifetime cancer on that. That's kind of like what they target with that. I will give you a couple other useful facts here. Is like an ISS mission. Again, it's in the magnetosphere. Has about it's a 6-month mission. Has about 72 millisieverts. A CT scan's about 10 millisieverts. You know this better than anybody. But it's hard to compare. Sometimes it's nice to use those comparisons, like a 10 millisievert CT scan compared to say 1,300 or a 1.3 sievert trip, but they're very different types of radiations. In fact, a lot of our data about the impacts of radiation is based on the atomic bomb studies and surveillance data that we've got from that. And that's a totally different type of radiation a lot of people think. So there is we know what the radiation will look like, but there's still a big question mark about the human impact on that. And so we've got some data from astronauts who have flown to space. We know people have gotten larger doses over time. We're not seeing kind of the typical curve of cancers in those individuals. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the radiation.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of work still needs to be done to safely put humans in that condition. What about, and the other kind of challenges that are obvious, but insanely cold temperatures sounds like, from what I was reading, minus 70 degrees Celsius, no oxygen, and a significantly reduced gravitational pull, such that your musculoskeletal system over time is going to take a hit. How do you plan on having the astronauts deal with these challenges?
Well, the cold is something. It's interesting. Like, if you're in space, you're basically at negative, or sorry, you're at near absolute zero. If you're in the sun, it can certainly get a lot warmer, but there's certainly periods of time during a extravehicular activity or a spacewalk where you could be in the shadows and you could be close to absolute zero out there. So we have some experience with extremely cold environments, and it basically amounts to an ECLIS system, or an environmental life support system, which is essentially what the ISS continually operates up there. So I think like the solution for that is likely to build this kind of base that has its own system that can keep people warm, also keep their atmosphere close to what we expect it to be. How do you set that up on Mars? Well, the moon's a good platform for doing that. So if you can set up a base on the moon, which is a little bit closer, you can get there faster, and you can certainly test out things. You certainly have an opportunity to do that. And I think that's what, in the near term, NASA's been gearing up for with the Artemis program, uh, to put a footprint there, and then to use that footprint to learn about, hey, how do you exist on a surface in these harsh extreme conditions? The weightlessness is, like 0.38 gravity. The moon's about a sixth of uh, Earth's gravity. So the interesting thing is it's harder to retain muscle and counteract the bone loss in zero gravity than it is on one of these partial gravity uh, areas, and that's because if you were to just go on to space station and you weren't to do any exercise, you'd lose 3% of your bone mass every month, and you can just think about that adding up over time. And then you'd lose, and even in the first week or so, you lose about 10% of your muscle mass and cardiovascular capability. However, over time with the space station, what we've learned is a significant amount of weight training plus treadmill training is able to counteract that. The structures of the bones change, like your trabecula is a little bit different in your hips, but you can retain a lot of that bone mass if you're looking at people on average. So we have ways to do it, but now get out of like microgravity, where you're like near zero, and you go onto Mars and you have some gravity. You can get a bench press to work like a earthbound bench press. So if you just put enough weight on it, even if you put a multiplier of 0.38 on that weight, you can get up to whatever you're doing on Earth. So you can create comparable exercise systems because you can utilize that gravity, but just put more mass there to counteract it. So there's ways to do that.
The other thing I was reading about that's kind of, I don't think people realize, but it's the mental wellness on such a long trip. Number one, the kind of teamwork, dealing with conflict that is normal with any humans that are in a small confined space now for what looks like to be several years. How does NASA plan to screen and potentially deal with mental issues? Number one, teamwork, conflict, and then being far away from Earth for several years, far away from friends and family. How are they addressing those mental needs?
Yeah, I think there's a couple prongs to that. One is the space station is this confined environment where you're with somebody for 6 months to a year, and so and you're tired at times, and you're overworked at times, and you're away from home. And you're right, that's one of the biggest challenges. And so they definitely they're going through a selection process right now, and one of the huge factors is people's ability to just work on teams that they're actively selecting for. And not only do they actively select for it, but they develop it in us through training. And honestly, this was something I wish I had insight into 10 years ago, because it would have helped me in all of my jobs that I did. It's 30 years ago, which is it's pretty simple, but it's worth working on. Is communication with people is what it comes down to, is the key, and being able to have difficult conversations with people. So NASA will put us in training events as astronaut candidates, as astronauts, as teams, where we're forced to be in stressful events. Life will give you that anyways, so everyone has this training, but they help us and coach us through how do you have a conversation when you're angry at someone. It doesn't make a lot of sense. um, how do you resolve that? And it comes down to just being able to talk about it and trust that the other person has positive intentions as well. And so that's a lot of thing I've sometimes pushed at NASA into my discomfort zone of like, I don't really want to have this conversation, but I know it's important. And then just dove into it, and then found out that it led to a better relationship on the other side, and then felt more confident in doing it again, and then built trust among the team. Because when your teammate knows that you're going to bring something up that's bothering you, not sit on it, stuff it, or have it blow out in a weird way, they're more comfortable, like, in that teamwork environment. So I think they do a lot of training there in that sphere. There's also some other things that they do with an eye towards these long-term missions, like just Mars itself. There's some analog missions that are out there, um, that are allowing people to go through this and figure out what the challenges are and what things we can do to resolve some of those challenges.
Yeah, I always think about it. And it's like on Earth, you have a bad conflict, you have a bad fight. You're like, whatever, you just walk away. You don't see them
Yeah,
for a while.
yeah,
Here, you're like, I don't agree. And here I am. We can't go anywhere.
yeah, yeah. But I would
so yeah,
argue that it's worth on Earth pushing into those conflicts sometimes and trying to make them right, because gosh, I've found so much growth in that. And like I said, I've been more into it lately because of all this training, but I certainly could have done it before. And some people are, there's a lot of ways to get good at that.
So you mentioned the Artemis program, going to the moon to practice going to Mars. When realistically is the timetable for sending another NASA astronaut or team up to the moon?
um, we're the current Artemis timeline is to launch it in 2026. So that's the goal. As you know, there's always technological challenges, and so um, plus or minus a little bit of time, I think, from what I'm saying, things are on track. So hopefully, in the near future, I can safely say we'll see we'll see someone orbit the moon with Artemis 2, and then the Artemis 3 mission is targeted to put boots on the moon. And so hopefully that isn't too far after Artemis 2. So hopefully I was clear there in that the Artemis 2 mission is targeting 2026 right now.
Great. All right. Not too far away. And then along those lines, if everything goes on schedule, has NASA released realistic ETAs for sending humans to Mars? Like a rough time range?
Yeah, I think those when you start to talk about times that are um, like the next step missions, it's as much a function of um, how we are it's kind of it's hard to predict because it's dependent on technology development plus um, the type of focus that we're doing, and we've certainly heard a lot of discussion about Mars and the moon, and so it really depends on kind of the change and what we see with the new administration coming on, where they place an emphasis, and how that all shakes out. So the answer to that question is I don't know, but we are certainly seeing continued interest in it, and we're just eagerly awaiting to see what the new administration directs us to do. And as NASA astronauts, we're going to get behind that with full excitement. And I'd say everyone at NASA will too.
Awesome to hear. Based on your SpaceX background, I wanted to ask you, Elon Musk stated that his plans are to send 1 million humans to Mars via SpaceX in the next 20 years. Now that you're at NASA and you've known how complex this is that crazy or is that just ambitious?
Um, I would, I would never uh, call his technological capabilities crazy. I think I'm certainly not a stockbroker, but I wouldn't short sell him on anything. So you never know. I personally am really hopeful that we get there within that time frame. I want to see it happen while I'm working at NASA, which I plan to do for a long time, and it would be great to be part of that effort, to watch it happen and support other people as they do it, or to participate in it, even myself. Even when I wasn't an astronaut, I just wanted to contribute to the effort of something that epic and that inspiring.
I would say, people might ask why, right? Like, why are we pushing to put a human on Mars? But give us a little background. I mean, how could the knowledge gained from going to Mars help us manage some of the global crises that we experience here on Earth?
Yeah, there's a bunch of people that are like me and like the other tens of thousands of people at NASA and in the space industry that are just inspired by doing that kind of engineering. And when you give them something that they are just really excited about and interested about, they push into that field. But on the side, they create all sorts of other opportunities and successes along the way. A good example is the Commercial Crew Program. There was people at SpaceX who wanted to create um, a rocket and launch it into space, and they were supported by the NASA's Commercial Crew Program, and they succeeded, and they wound up with what you have today for SpaceX, which is launching Starlink satellites, which gives internet to all sorts of places around the world. So the offshoot of that early program indirectly leads to communication capabilities somewhere. So it's hard to pinpoint where that's going to happen in the future, but it's going to happen because we've seen it happen. And there's a lot of examples of spin-offs and things like that. But I think you give a lot of talented people an epic challenge, like going to the moon, going to Mars, and they'll just create something fantastic that benefits us all. And so I think it's super important for us to continue to do those kind of opportunities in parallel with all the other important things that we do in this world. So,
Along those lines about helping us here on Earth, many people say that with all of the existential crises that are mounting here on Earth, and just a few overpopulation, global warming, all these types of threats that really risk our species, our civilization. Do you believe that landing humans on Mars is important for us to sustain our species eventually?
um, I do think it's important because um, you can't, you can't do these things in serial. Essentially, like you can't start and complete one thing, like solve maybe climate issue, and then start thinking about space. I think it all of these things are so complicated. We need to do them at the same time, and we have the people and the interests, and it also gives people an opportunity to go into something they're excited about and that they thrive in, and to create that kind of excitement and energy. It's kind of like um, telling your kids, like, hey, we've got one problem in life and you're going to study math and then you're going to solve this problem. Like, you want them to do what inspires them, because that's when they bring their best to the world. And I think space is something that inspires a lot of people and should be done in parallel with all these other important things we need to do in the world. And I think the big step, the next couple big steps for us are really taking the knowledge we have in station, going to the moon, going to Mars. And that's what, when I look around me at my colleagues at NASA and my colleagues in commercial space, and even friends, like, those are the things that really get people inspired and excited about um, the future and contributing.
So, Neil, $1 million question. No timeline on this, but in your opinion, do you think humans will ever permanently settle on Mars? That we will have a civilization and a society on Mars?
Well, if you're asking my personal opinion on this one, then
Correct.
my personal opinion, I feel super confident that we're going to do this. We've seen such marked achievements in the past decade, that it's hard to believe that if we continue to work together, we continue to create opportunities for people, we won't be able to do something that remarkable. And I hope it happens within my lifetime, and I can see it happen. Um, if you just think about the engineering challenges that you've seen happen from multiple commercial space companies launching rockets, um, to some of them financing their own commercial probes, to self-landing rockets, to the size of these rockets. That's just that side. And then yeah, it's hard to believe we won't have that. That's why I'm so excited about space medicine in particular, um, because I think there's going to be a whole new, field that warrants having lots of medical students going into this to just study how these impacts happen when people are actually living on a different planet. We'll have maybe a section in each medical textbook for each field that says this is how you treat things on Mars. So I definitely believe that. And I said I was hopeful to see it happen in my lifetime, but personally, I feel like I will see it. I'm really inspired, and feel like it's right around the corner.
Neil, what an amazing interview. I'm going to let you go because it's nighttime over there in Russia, and I'm sure you have a packed schedule tomorrow. But loved talking to you, and I think that, like you said, going to Mars inspires people. It's such an it's such an ambitious goal, but I think very, very doable. And we touched on it towards the end. I just think that if you look at the trajectory of us on Earth, at some point, this Earth is not going to be sustainable. That's just the natural progression of what we're seeing for all the different threats that I mentioned before. Plus, asteroids coming or what have you. There's all these different threats. It seems like going to Mars would ensure us sustaining our species over time. And so, kudos to all you do. Unbelievable challenge in front of you and all of your colleagues. And again, kudos for all you do. It is very inspirational. And as a personal note, I always wanted to be an astronaut. If I couldn't be a brain surgeon, I would have been an astronaut. So love everything you do, and hopefully you're up there and you go to the moon and you're the guy that goes to Mars.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun talking to you. And yeah, I'm maybe we'll have you write the textbook on neurosurgery on Mars, and so we can talk.
I'd love to, man. Listen, thanks so much for your time.
Okay,
Have a great night, and we'll talk
you
soon, my
too.
friend.
Good talking to you.